what is that sort of thing that makes them great? And I really think it's just one thing. Being a maintainer, sometimes you feel like you have like an albatross. If you are looking to get into open source, I think a very good way to do it is to, maybe because of that, open source still feels very relevant to me. Like, that really is most of the value of a senior technical person.
I'd love to welcome Dr. Rebecca Bilbro today. Rebecca has kind of been the antithesis to people who think you can either think with the right side of your brain or the left side of your brain. She's double majored in English and math, a pairing that you don't see very often. But after that, she saw the light and went and did her PhD in actual math. So we're glad to have her. And so Rebecca, like me, has graduated into just about the worst job market that our generation has seen. Despite that, her skills were able to carry her to a job with the Department of Labor, where she has pioneered a lot of data science techniques that were just coming out in the early 20-teens. Then she went on to work with the Department of Commerce, where she's refined her craft. She's then worked for several startups in a row. And that, as if that wasn't enough, she also taught at Georgetown for about 9 years. Teaching is something that Rebecca is really passionate about. She has done it, as a teacher at Georgetown. She's also going to a lot of conferences and giving a lot of talks about what she's found out. She's helped a lot of people early in their career. She's even written 2 Safari books. One wasn't enough. The books are on very different subjects. One is about NLP, which, fun fact, the last time, or one time that I talked to Rebecca in 2016, I think, she was saying, I think all of this stuff about image processing is really cool, but language is next. And 2017 is when Attention Is All You Need paper comes out, so she's proven herself to be quite a prophet of things that are yet to come. She's also written a very popular library, Yellow Brick, for data science. It currently has 4.3 thousand stars, which puts it squarely in the 0.5 top repositories on GitHub. And then leveraged it into a company where she's been for the last 4 years now. So the Rotational Labs is the name of it, and one of their, or I guess the main product is Ensign. And being from Utah, I have to say Ensign. I'm sorry, this is kind of a thing that you have to do here. Which aims to help people use streaming data as well as, if not better, than we used to use data at rest. And so, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to be the first on the podcast. And Rebecca, we just talked about a whole bunch of your many accomplishments, but what I would love to know is, how does it feel from the inside? What have you learned over your career? And kind of, if you can walk me through the things about this journey that somebody just reading your resume can't tell, but you definitely can.
I think that there's maybe I think one of the themes probably in my answers to a lot of these kinds of questions, like one of the common questions that you get is like, how do you keep up with the field? And so I think my answer to a lot of these kinds of questions is to kind of try to focus on patterns instead of details, to the extent that that's possible. And so I'm going to try to do that to sort of answer your question. So I would say, like, some of the patterns I think in my career progression and sort of the decisions that I've made that took me, into machine learning engineering, and then maybe around machine learning engineering now, whatever it is I do now. I think some of the kind of, one of the key patterns is the idea of unusual combinations. So you mentioned, my majors as an undergrad, I studied math and English, which is an unusual, like statistically rare combination of people to double major because there's not a lot of overlap in requirements, so it's not particularly efficient. But it was enormously beneficial to me. I think that if you want to help describe novelty or identify novelty, looking at the intersection between two things that feel sort of disparate can be helpful, just as a thought experiment, just generally as a strategy. So I would say, and actually to slightly modify what you said, when I actually went to grad school and I got my PhD, it's not in math, it's actually in like technical communication. So it's the way I think of it is like my PhD was in domain-specific languages. So like learning how to start to describe different engineering disciplines in terms of like a domain, like in, you know, the way that we communicate in chemical engineering is different from how we communicate in material science, and how that manifests in like different types of charts and visualizations and schema diagrams that help us do the work that kind of, you know, allows things to progress and allows science to progress, and society. So but I think combinations are really interesting. And I think that that's a pattern. So like Yellow Brick is another example of combinations, right? Taking like, you know, the best of both worlds of Matplotlib and scikit-learn to sort of say, how can we kind of write out some common functionality that unifies these two APIs that everybody loves already, so that it's easier to do basically like hypothesis testing around machine learning. Like, is this the right model for the data? ? And then you can use a visualization to say, no, that is not the correct model for this data because you can see there's heteroscedasticity in the chart or something like that, where, you know, there's too many outliers, or where, you know, the line of best fit is way off from from what it should be. So, you know, I think that those combinations is a common theme. I think maybe like two other ones that I would throw out there. Collaboration is really important to me. Basically, that was one of the things that I was in grad school for a very long time, probably longer than I would recommend to other people. Even if you decide to go to grad school, don't do it for like 8 years. I did it for 8 years because it was subsidized. You know, I was subsidizing my own education, but it's not very efficient. But I think what I realized towards the end of because I was sort of planning to go into academia. That was my plan. Both of my parents are academics. My brother also went into PhD right out of undergrad. So I kind of just figured that's what I was doing too. But I think towards the end, what I realized is what I liked the most about academia was collaboration and not publication, and that was important. So, and collaboration continues to be really important. And I think a third pattern that's really important to me is the idea of control. And that is ultimately what drove me to kind of sacrifice some of what I could do when I was purely a machine learning engineer, and somebody else was in charge of getting contracts and, you know, mentoring people and making, you know, the gears turn correctly. When I could just focus in on, you know, just the MLE stuff, I felt kind of a constant irritation with how things were being done or which things were being prioritized, and basically, you know, who I was allowed to collaborate with and who I was not allowed to collaborate with. And ultimately, I was willing to make the sacrifice, you know, in order to have more control, but it's a lot more responsibility. And I'm sure we'll talk about entrepreneurship a little bit more, but I'm happy to sort of sing the praises, but also be sage and cautious about how to proceed in a way that is, you know, maybe a little bit more efficient or has a higher probability of success than just kind of random search.
For sure. What drove you to start Rotational? I mean, obviously the mission is something that you've been passionate about. I know the people that you've started with are people that you've worked with before. What would you say is driving you to it, and like, what do you feel like you're doing? Because you could go out into market today and find a better job, right? Or find a great job, rather. I don't know. Better is subjective. But Yeah. Why do you
Yeah,
do it
I
today?
mean, to be honest with you, I don't think I agree with that. Like, um, there is no other team like Rotational's team. I've
Yeah.
worked in a lot of teams, and this is the only one that works like this. Um, it's extraordinarily high trust. People have a lot of responsibility, and there's a lot of respect. People encourage each other. People are excited to do code reviews and excited to do pair programming. They do it without being told to. And they're all excited to keep doing stuff. They are all excited to work together. And I think that that's really special. And that was the reason and is the reason.
Yeah. No, and that's terrific. And it does look like you guys are putting out a lot of great stuff. And I really appreciate that, at least the things that I hear about it, right, in my interactions. It doesn't seem like you're after the hype. It seems like you're after building the actual technology, which sometimes in this industry people go out after the trendy thing. And it just so happens that your thing is also trendy. But that's an outcome, not necessarily a goal. So let's maybe talk about entrepreneurship a little bit since you brought it up. So you've transitioned into it after being an individual contributor for a while, and I know that all of us probably have things that we would have done a little bit more efficiently or differently afterwards. And since I really want this podcast to focus kind of on the main principles, and some MLEs are going to want to go into entrepreneurship, how do you see that transition? How would you, if your brother was going that route or your kid was going that route and you had to tell them to not step on the same rakes you did, but maybe step on slightly different rakes, and also maybe some good things that come of it. You've mentioned control. You've mentioned being able to build a team that you love working with. There have been many times in my career working in really big companies where it's like, these are people on your team, and you're like, oh, they don't really all fit here. Like, I would rearrange this a little bit, but you can't. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is like the team is really, I think, the core of the answer here to the entrepreneurship question. If you are really, whether your strength is in business or your strength is in tech, like, you can't do it alone. And I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I'm sure you could go out there and buy a book that says how to do it all alone, but you can't. It's too hard. There's too much stuff to do.
So how did you build such a great team? Like, how do you find people?
They find us. I'm serious. That's what happens. People come to us, and they come to us, and we meet them at a conference, or we meet them at a hackathon, or we meet them because they email us and they say, this is kind of neat, or I want to ask you a question about this, and we stay in touch, and then 2 years later, 3 years later, 6 months later, something, we need somebody, and I guess we realized that they were the one that we needed all along. I realize that sounds a little woo-woo, but that's happened multiple times already. People find us and they reach out and they sign up.
That's great. That's great. How many people do you have now?
I think it is somewhere between 10 and 12 full-time people. It's actually starting to get, I know that sounds really small to everybody else, but to me it sounds like the biggest number because, I was around when it was 0.
Yeah.
So we literally this week, Monday, had a new machine learning engineer start.
Uh-huh.
So we are growing, but we are trying to grow slowly because, really our number one operating expense is salaries, which feels right to me. This is hard. People should get paid for it, So our main expense is salaries, so we are very cautious and strategic about growing quickly, but we are growing.
Excellent. Yeah, no, and I think it's really smart. You know, I think you see a lot of people who get ahead of what they can manage, and I've tried this several times now where I've grown a team, and it feels like, you know, just get more people, right? But then like you bring them in, you have to onboard them, and then like you run out of tasks to delegate because there's some things that are way easier to delegate than others. I don't know. I have control issues myself sometimes, and it's like I'm not going to give you this because I know I can knock this out of the park in a few minutes, and to like onboard something on this is a long time. So kind of along those lines, right? That you want to get the best people. What you've been an MLE for a long time. I'm gonna still keep calling you an MLE. Sorry, but what makes a great MLE? What's like the delta between somebody who's like, or even you, right? Like I'm sure at some points in your career you've been better than others. What are those things that take you from one level of this to like, I hate to use the term 10x engineer, but you know, toward that?
Honestly, I think it's like one thing. Like it really is. Like I thought you sent these questions to me in advance. I don't know if everybody in the audience knows that, but
No, I'm
I
gonna
got
bleep
this.
that out. These are all new. You're answering off the cuff.
Extemporaneous. But you sent these questions in advance, and I thought about this question the most of all of the questions. Is like, what is that sort of thing that makes them great? And I really think it's just one thing. Although I'm going to say a second thing after it, so I don't sound like I'm closed-minded. But it really is a willingness to figure things out in the middle of them being on fire, or not on fire, but just like a terrible wreck, a disaster. And the reason that that's the differentiator is that that is what it seems like nobody else is willing to do. Like nobody else on the team, when it comes to like machine learning projects, of course, there are many engineers who are used to kind of like, scrubbing in and doing miserable work. But like machine learning engineers are the ones who are willing to scrub in when the model training pipeline or the prediction pipeline is not working properly. Because I think it's just about, a willingness to jump in to a burning building. And not everybody wants to do that. In fact, the majority of people do not want to do that.
Yeah, and in my experience, at least, if they do that, they do it to check off, like, oh, okay, the production is no longer on fire, rather than going down to that, like, the 5 whys or whatever, like, to get down to the very bottom of it and be like, oh, actually, I could fix the top line problem, but there's still going to be issues over and over again if we don't fix this, like, really core thing. And to me, at least, I come from a different world than you. I come from actually, we come from the same world, but we've diverged since. But in big companies, there's a tendency to say, like, the thing is no longer on fire, it's not my problem. And being able to get a little bit deeper than that and say, but why was it? It's not normal for it to be on fire in the first place. I think that's a very important thing. What is the second thing? You said two.
So I just want to acknowledge that I really like what you added on to what I said, which is like kind of being willing to solve tomorrow's problem today. I think is also, just like that's such a useful skill to have, to cultivate in yourself. And it's hard to when everything feels like it's on fire, but like to the extent that you can cultivate that in yourself as a machine learning engineer and like think a little bit further ahead and say, how can I solve this forever? Not just for today. How do I make sure that this doesn't happen again? What does that look like? That's really useful. But what I was going to say is collaboration. And I know that sounds kind of like also a little bit woo-woo, but what I mean is like, if you are not doing code reviews, if you are not doing pair programming, if you are not participating in sprints, like, are you really collaborating? Or are you just rewriting what other people have written?
is there a difference between you and the generative AI at that point, right? Like, yeah, no, for sure. And you mentioned code reviews. I'm gonna pick on that for a little bit. So like, a lot of code reviews that I've seen in my life is LGTM, right? And that's I work with senior engineers always to be like, please don't do that. Like, if you have, it is very rare that a junior is going to commit code and you're going to not have anything to add to that. Okay, like if you're reviewing principal engineer's code, maybe, but usually like there's something in there. Do you have kind of a best practice for this and being like, or maybe things you teach your team to be like, please don't just like look at it superficially and be like, yep, at the very top level, it doesn't break anything. I'm going to commit it.
I have sort of like an maybe unconventional answer to this, which is part one. I think the onus is on the PR opener. Mm-hmm. Like, ask questions. What do you want them to focus on? What are you worried about? Like, where are you worried there might be a memory leak? Like, where did something funny happen where you were like, man, I banged my head against the wall for an hour before I realized that this should be a semicolon.
Yeah.
Like, put those notes in. Like, make it fun to read. That's on you.
Yeah.
So I guess that's like slightly an unconventional answer. But the other like slightly part two of unconventional answer is I think it's okay to LGTM a junior's PR sometimes, right? Because strategically doing that is saying like, you need to write code that could get merged directly into main or develop or however you do it. Yeah. Like, we're not messing around here. And so I think, and also that's like, it's a sign of trust. Like, you trust them, you believe in them, and so like sometimes I think a strategic LGTM on something is exactly the right thing to do. But, not, I mean, you like, people want to feel like you care about what they're doing. Yeah. And so you have to look at it in order to understand. So I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, no, I think that's a terrific answer. Speaking of code reviews, you've done quite a few of them through the open source project. And open source is kind of an interesting thing. I was reading Felix Hill's last blog post that made rounds recently, and he talks about, so he passed away late last year and had some struggles with emotional toll of being in this industry. And one of the things he talks about is being a researcher in the big company. A lot of people are starting to think, like, should we even publish stuff? Like, is this like our strategic advantage? And I think our industry grew up on open source. I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the reason that you and I both were able to make it into this industry is because everything was open, and it was like, if you had the curiosity, you can start in physics in my case, and in communication in your case, and be like, no, but I really want to learn this. It does sadden me that there is a little bit of the closeness now that didn't used to be there, but I still think open source is extremely important. Lots of folks are looking for it to like say, like, I am good enough to do that job. I can come contribute to your project. Do you have any like best practices for somebody who's trying to contribute into this? And also kind of want to get your take on, is open source all that important today? Or with like these huge models that like, I can give you all the code for it, you're still not going to be able to do anything with it unless you have, $5 million in GPUs and tons of data. Like, is that still something that's important in our industry?
It's a good question. I think that there are a lot of reasons that people love open source or who have been committed to it in the past. But I think one of the things that I like the most about it is the exercise in transparency. And I think maybe because of that, open source still feels very relevant to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So how would you get started in it? Say I've never made a contribution. I come to Yellow Break and I'm like, I want to help.
Okay.
I want to get a job with Rebecca. I want to show her that I got this.
So I think that I think maybe to kind of piggyback on the idea of transparency, I think that I gave a talk at PyData London last year called Mistakes Were Made, which was like basically me talking about a bunch of mistakes I've made in my like data science, logical errors or kind of, engineering errors that I've made over my career and talking about what I learned from those mistakes. Like, I think to extend that, like that really is most of the value of a senior technical person. It's somebody who has made a lot of mistakes and understands why they were mistakes and can sort of talk about that and, has learned to make better mistakes or new mistakes, right? And so I think that if you are looking to get into open source, I think a very good way to do it is to inspect your own code, like your own workflow with whatever tool it is. Or let's say you have a set of tools that you use. Inspect that workflow. Identify the sort of clunkiest parts in your code and like think about them a little bit more and think about why they are clunky. Like, are they clunky because the tools that you're using don't have a function that like does a thing, and so you have to write this hacky function that like helps you jump from step B to step C. So think about those clunky bits in your code. And then you have to sort of ask the question, is this clunky because I wrote it badly and I don't really understand the tools I'm using, or maybe is there some functionality that is missing from the tool? And even if it is a very small piece of functionality, like very, very small, like a small string manipulation thing or a small compression thing or a small filtering thing. Just think about like all of the little things you have to do to get data to do what you want it to do. All of those little tiny steps. So like you should sort of get curious about whether some of those steps like don't need to be that hard. And like, what does that even mean? Like, what would it mean to make this easier? Like, could I take these two tools that like work together and figure out some way to make them interface better? Like, what is missing there? So kind of thinking about what is the shim? Mm-hmm. Like, what's the shim that makes everything work slightly better or slightly faster or slightly easier to put together, slightly easier to run experiments, slightly easier to test, is this working in production or whatever? And open a PR for just that specific teeny tiny little thing. And everybody else probably will be like, oh, that is clearly a gap. And even if your PR sucks, if you're right in identifying a gap, they will be motivated to help you like edit the PR to fill the gap, because once they know that there's a gap, then they want to fill it, and they'll help you probably. I mean, your mileage may vary. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's one strategy. Another strategy is if you are at a big organization, you propose if what you really want is to contribute to open source, like the next time there's a big meeting in your big organization, they're like, we want to do good for the public. Be like, oh, why don't we there's a project coming up. Here's a piece of it that we could open source. And we could kind of separate it from the rest of the stuff that needs to be internal and proprietary. And that'll be good for image, and marketing will love it. And probably they'll say yes, and then you get to be a contributor and they're paying you to do it. So like that works too, probably. But
yeah, be a little bit careful with that strategy. So
you might know about that one better than me.
Yeah, I had a major project at Twitter that we were going to open source, and it was on track, and we got a couple of companies that work with us, like well, I don't know that I should mention which ones they were, but to use it internally as well, because, a company like Twitter is not going to launch something that only worked once. Like, we need to work it in a little bit. And that was enough time for changes in management that have changed the direction of the company. I mean, it's not even called the same anymore. So forget about open sourcing model evaluation frameworks. That got axed pretty quickly.
But yeah, look for little tiny things, like little shims, I think, are surprisingly effective.
And what I really like about what you said is like, start with your own problem, because lots of people come and they're like, oh, I'm going to look at like the concerns that are raised on the repository, and I'm going to go through those, and I'm going to be a hero, and I'm going to fix them. And I'm like, well, there's a reason why some of them are not fixed, and you probably don't know it. And so I wonder if you can take us backstage to what the other side of open source looks like, and how awesome it is, and how everybody's always nice to you, and it's just come in and do LGTM and everything works swimmingly.
I am a little reluctant to be critical because I do feel like I owe open source, a lot.
Yeah, but I'm not necessarily asking you to say like bad things about people who are contributing, but I am. I think it helps a lot in trying to get your stuff accepted to know that the person on the other side probably only has like 30 seconds to look at it on the top line, right? And very quickly has to judge what this is like. So maybe like you want to put a little bit more of a commit message than like fixed an issue, or something like this. So I think knowing it from your side that way is really useful.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how to describe people who kind of who exhibit this behavior, but there are people like contributors who come with their own sail, like their own energy, their own wind, and for some reason, even if they are new to Python, or even if they are new to machine learning, or new to contributing, maybe even new to using version control. Because honestly, a lot of data scientists do not consider version control as sort of a primary core skill. And I'm not sure what machine learning engineers think now, but I feel like that is a core skill in order to function. But like even if that's not something that but you are motivated to try and figure it out and figure out how to do like GPG commit signing so that we're merging into the repo in a way that's safe so that people can feel that sense of security about the software supply chain, because that's important too, right? I mean, but if people come with their own energy, that goes a long way. Because like you said, it can be a little bit of a downer. I think that open source was a gift to me. It's, it helped me learn so much. But it's, being a maintainer, sometimes you feel like you have like an albatross. And so people who come in with like a little bit of oomph, just make it easier to go a little bit longer. And that oomph could come from contributors, but it can also come from like all kinds of, I remember early on when Yellowbrick started to catch on, one of the very most exciting things for me and Benjamin Bangford, who's my co-author and co-maintainer of the project from the very beginning, one of the most exciting things was seeing other people write blog posts that use Yellowbrick, like people we didn't know, people we had never met before. And that gave us a big oomph. I can tell you like that made it really easy to spend like nights and weekends working on Yellowbrick for years and years and years, just kind of powered by like, wow, that's so neat. People we've never met before are using this tool. And it seems like it's helping. So I don't know. There's good and bad. But it's been a big part of my career.
Would you do it again if I dropped you back there and said, this is all you're going to have to deal with, this is all that's going to come of it, right? Like, would you do it again?
I mean, I think that the answer must be yes, because many of the people who are part of Rotational now, like Benjamin Bangfort and Edwin Schmier, so my two co-founders, as well as Prima Roman, our senior most engineer, and Patrick Dazil, who's a contributor to Yellowbrick, like all of those people were involved in Yellowbrick, and working on Ensign, which was one of the products you mentioned at the beginning, was an open source project that we all built together. So that's open source, and actually, it's not even our only product. Our new one that we're working on is another open source. It's another open source project that's kind of like an AI studio kind of thing. But I I think the answer must be yes. Based on, if we're kind of using that as the data, I think we are still doing this. Like it for us, this works as a way to develop in a way that makes us feel creative, like we're getting credit for our creativity, because that's one of the other great things about open source. Like you feel like you're being acknowledged because of commit signing and Git histories and Git blame and stuff like that, but also the transparency part, right? Like feeling like I don't have to claim on LinkedIn that I'm doing things the right way or that we're doing things the real way. You can just look at the code and you can decide for yourself.
No, for sure. And I love that attitude that I think you've always had, that like, I'm going to go do stuff and like, that's going to speak for itself, rather than, lots of people who are good at selling themselves, but then you're like, can't explain convolutional neural nets. And you're like, you've been an image for a long time. Like you should be able to know this. So yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And I'm sorry, like I'm noticing how much I botched the introduction of you. You guys got multiple products. I did not know that. But yeah. So in all of this, you do a lot. You happen to be carrying quite a bit. And so tell me, like, what optimizations to your workflow have you been able to find over the years that have made you faster, better, maybe fewer mistakes, whatever, right? Like whatever you think is more efficient. What have you found that really works well?
I think this is a great question. I honestly think that this is maybe, when I think about it, this is maybe another thing that sort of differentiates machine learning engineers from maybe people who are only sort of occasionally doing machine learning engineering type things, or only occasionally, the people who are kind of hobbyists versus people who kind of are doing this all the time, is that there's kind of a drive towards seeking out optimizations, right? Because like once you do something enough or it's painful enough, you're like, I'm never doing it that sucky way again. Like there's got to be a better way, and I think that idea of like there's got to be a better way is really important. I think that it's really interesting that you asked the question about like tooling and optimizations, because I'm right in the very middle of a sort of evaluation, and it's not a kind of scientific evaluation. It's kind of a qualitative evaluation of different generative AI tools, and I'm doing it collaboratively with one of my colleagues, Ryan, who is he's maybe one of the biggest users of AI at Rotational, and he does a lot of biz dev type stuff, but he's exceptionally good at identifying use cases for tools and like coming up with these kinds of optimizations. And I do think that part of the trick is delegation, which is something that came up earlier, and it was like delegation with respect to people, but like part of optimization is like a willingness to cede control and delegate to, whether that's to like a hotkey or a shortcut on your keyboard, or like using GitHub Copilot or something like that. I will admit I officially have access to GitHub Copilot through Rotational. We have like everybody has a subscription. I have not really made a huge amount of use of that one yet. But it's not because it's just, I have a long to-do list. Like you said, I've got a lot of things to do. It's on my list. But I have been exploring kind of like using ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, kind of doing like a little bit of a bake-off with Ryan, thinking about the extent to which they're useful and what some of the sort of evaluative criteria are in our kind of weird ad hoc like qualitative evaluation of these tools. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, like, because the evaluations that you're used to seeing when you're a machine learning engineer are like, which one can do arithmetic? Which one can count the R's in strawberry? Right. So like the evaluative measures are good, like they're heuristic in the sense that there's a yes and a no. So like they're good for measuring things, but like, do we care what they're measuring? Like, because really what you want to know is like, does this actually optimize my workflow, right? And so we were kind of making this list of things, and it seems like one of the main things is tools that help, that remember stuff about you, so you don't have to keep reintroducing yourself and your context and doing that over and over, is really helpful. And even when you can do that at the granularity of a project, that's very helpful to be able to say, like, and whether that's like a Gen AI tool or a tool like Shortcut, which is what we use for project management, or Slack or things like that, when you give people the option to group things, like kind of put things into logical categories, that's very powerful. And I do think that, like, I noticed that a lot about tooling. So in the tools that we use, which, as I said, I think those are some of the main ones. One of the new ones that I have started using, which is not an AI tool, is a little like a sketch tool called Excalidraw, which I like using for making like little quick whiteboard drawings. Because I honestly think that the one thing that I really miss about being in person for work is whiteboarding.
Yeah.
Because that was critical and still is critical to my thought process. Like, I am very visual. I like sketching out pipelines and talking them through and thinking about how things might fall apart and stuff like that. And whiteboarding is critical to that. So I like using Excalidraw for that. So maybe I'll call out that one particularly because I'm experimenting with that a lot right now. But a few days ago,
I use Excalidraw all the time.
Do you?
I think it's a terrific tool, and it's
interesting.
It's open enough, right, to where like you can just share it with somebody. They don't have to have anything installed, and I think it's really great for collaboration.
Interesting. Okay, well that's fascinating. It's another data point of somebody else who's found value in that. I will say there's another tool that I haven't used yet, but it's another one on my list, and it's actually pretty high on my list right now. There are a couple of tools that are coming out that are designed to make it easier to generate UIs using generative AI. So basically, like, they map out, it's not just like the design, it's also mapping out the interactions. Like, okay, if you create this button, then it's got to have this breakout page and they're connected to each other. And so kind of like cooking that some of that into the templating so that you don't have to do all of that work. I think that's like very interesting, because on the one hand, I've historically been like maybe not the biggest fan of like low code tooling, but I also recognize that for data science in particular, the reason that the division between machine learning engineering and data science, or one of the reasons why it's so rough, is that data scientists operate outside of the application stack. They're working in PowerPoints. They're working in Jupyter Notebooks. They're working in, like that kind of environment. Whereas machine learning engineers are operating in the application stack. We're working in Kubernetes clusters. We're working in, Docker containers. We're working in Python files. Like, there are READMEs, right? Like it's a different, there's CI/CD, right? It's interacting with a production database. So I think that being able to appreciate that is really key. So for machine learning engineers, you sort of started this by saying, like, there's so many things that feel obvious that when other people kind of say something, you realize that this is something that's not obvious to them. But that thing of like working outside of the application stack and that being a risk to data scientists for like getting their stuff into production. I'm wondering if tools like, I think the one that I heard about was called Wizard, or it's like UI Wizard, but I think that other tools like Figma, there are a suite of new tools coming out that are supposed to make UI creation easier using generative AI, whether you're like typing a description of what you want and it's using a language model then to trigger the templating, or if you draw like a sketch, like an Excalidraw sketch, and you give them the sketch and they convert that into some kind of interaction, framework or wireframe or something. Like, I wonder if that has the potential to help bridge that gap a little bit, even if the UIs that they make are kind of disposable. Even if it just sort of helps you think a little bit about like what happens after training.
Yeah, no, I think I think you're right on there because, like, as I think about the biggest problems in my career, right, like, they're all things that people didn't think were that useful until I could put a prototype together. And guess what? I don't do JavaScript, right? Like, I cobble stuff together and it's really bad. And if I could outsource that part of it, like I can write an API with Python, right? But on the other side of it, I'm really bad. So it's really good to see what Rebecca is and is not willing to outsource to tools. And kind of this brings me out. This brings me to like a question that I think you're a terrific person to answer. Like from what I've seen of you, is oftentimes we end up collaborating with people who are not ML people. You know, oftentimes our leaders are not ML people, and so how do you manage? And again, you come from like communication. You come from like a perfect background for this. This is one thing that I struggle with. How do you manage articulating value, but at the same time the risk of machine learning projects? And you know, like I had bosses who were like, okay, so this has to be done by the 13th, and I'm like, I don't know. This is an iterative process. Like something will be done by 13th, but I don't know that I can hit 96% accuracy by the 13th or whatever. You know, like how do you have those conversations from the very inception of the project and convincing that like I guess nowadays nobody needs to be convinced that ML is needed. Now I spend most of my time convincing people where ML is not needed. But how do you have those conversations?
I have a couple of thoughts there. I've been sort of thinking about the idea of design docs, which I think is kind of connected to what you're saying. It's like those pieces of rhetoric that exist between you, the technical person, and whoever is like greenlighting the project, who is usually less technical than you. And maybe I'm not sure if it's true where you work, but you know, design docs are kind of one of those things. Like, what is the most like? How do you write design docs that kind of allow you to get your projects greenlit and move things forward? And I think that like the main thing is that they have to be confrontational, which surprises me a little bit to say because I think that my brand as a person is a lot about empathy and, you know, collaboration. But I think design docs need to be confrontational. And I think they need to say, right now, the way that we do this, it costs this much, it takes this long, we've been doing it this way, you know, it's gone wrong 6 times in the last 3 years. It happened on this date, on this date, on this date. Every time the reason that it went wrong is due to this problem. You know, you need to be confrontational because the most important thing is not like being able to convince them that you will definitely be able to train a model by the end of this. The most important thing to say is that we all agree that there's a problem.
Yeah.
And maybe
Yeah.
machine learning is the answer, but like first let's agree that there's a problem and it's serious enough for us to put attention on. And, you know, for sure we're going to try to use machine learning because that's one of the tools in the toolkit. But like first let's agree that there's a problem.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good approach. And like Meta, where I used to work, right, utilizes design docs quite extensively. But okay, so you bought me there. I agree there. But then the project gets underway, and inevitably there are things that like I didn't. Well, there's a no free lunch theorem, right? Like ahead of time I cannot tell you which ML technique would even work here, or even if I can narrow down to like a space of techniques, there's a hyperparameter that I'm not gonna know until I get into the model, and then I'm like, oh, that's gonna take me forever to tune, or maybe I can't even tune it. We were working at one of the places I was working at. We were working on color detection, and color detection seems like such an easy thing, but we were working on color detection outside, and like depending on the position of the sun and the cloudiness and whatever, like you can't even tell a beige from a gray, and expecting that your model is going to do that, and some of those things, obviously good MLE would point out from the beginning, But some of those things I don't know until I run into them. So how do you communicate those difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe I'll come back to the idea of transparency here, because the goal is not to deliver this one project and this is the end of everything, right? Like the goal is to build a pipeline so that we can do good, we can keep doing better and keep learning and keep introducing new products and new features. So the most important thing is to create kind of a healthy pipeline of experimentation. And to do that, you have to have trust. They have to trust you and you have to trust them. And the only way to do that is to be honest. And so like when you get to those stumbling blocks, you have to say, like in the, in that weekly meeting, you have to say, we encountered a blocker. This is what the blocker is. Here are 3 options that we're considering. We'll provide an update next week after we've run a couple of experiments. And, but like being able to be transparent and also kind of propose solutions so that you kind of build that trust that you are not going to panic and abandon the project at the first kind of hitch. That like it's hitches all the way down, baby.
Yeah.
Like
No, I totally agree with this. I will never forget the first time that I worked with like true team of MLEs, that was really good. And we came to the daily stand-up or whatever, and somebody was like, yeah, this whole thing we're working on doesn't work. And this one guy stands up and he's like, well, we got these 3 solutions. This one has these pros and these cons, and this other one has these pros and these cons. And I'm like, it like struck me how not stuck you are at any given point. That like, yeah, like the solution that you eventually propose is never going to be perfect, but at least you have ways forward, right? Like in my experience, the thing that I try to get juniors out of very early on is being stuck. Is like, oh, the first way didn't work. I don't know what to do. I'm like, okay, think, and really to me, this is as a leader, honestly, I love it when MLEs come to me and say, that didn't work, but I have 3 solutions. And I'm like, great, like we can start a conversation here again. So yeah, I definitely appreciate it. So let me just ask you one more question for this and then maybe give you a final word. But ML is an industry with a lot of hype, and it's an industry with a lot of technologies that come and go. And I think a trap that a lot of people fall into is that they try to learn everything or they give up, right? Like they either say like, this is way too much for me, or they try to learn everything. And so this is kind of a conglomeration of like, how do you navigate hype and how do you determine what's important and how do you stay up to date kind of all at the same time, is how does Rebecca figure out what's an interesting technology for you to learn? And how do you go about it?
It's good to go to conferences. So talk to other people.
Whoa. Most people that listen to this are incredibly introverted.
Yeah, but, if we all go to conferences together, then, we get it, right? Like we're all there, being introverts together. But yeah, go to conferences and listen to what other people are doing. And like I said, focus on patterns rather than details. Like, gosh, it seems like everybody is trying to solve like a problem around observability, with their pipelines. Like it's because that was like that for me, that was the theme maybe a couple of years ago. It seemed like every talk was about Prometheus and Grafana, mm-hmm. Right? Like how do we know when things go wrong, and how can I tell that things are going right, and like where did that throughput spike come from? That's why the model's broken. Like I think that going to conferences and looking for patterns across talks or across booths or sessions or whatever is really valuable. I guess like the flip side is if you are finding yourself miserable trying to keep up, that might be a clue that you don't really like this, and that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, one of the things I said on social media recently is like I've been irrelevant like 4 times in this career, like where honestly, and somebody commented underneath it and said, "Wow, you're really comfortable with being irrelevant," and I'm like, "You kind of have to be."
Yeah, I mean, like maybe said a slightly like more optimistic way. Like if you can cultivate an appetite for being a novice, like if it feels fun, like, ooh, I'm going to go out and try a new restaurant. Like that's something so fun that you're willing to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
Not get paid for it. You go and pay to eat at a new restaurant. Like you're paying for new experiences, right? So if you have that kind of attitude of like, I'm kind of curious about this. I wish I understood this a little bit more, which is, to be honest with you, it's sort of what took me kind of down some, sort of my path, right? I got curious about domain-specific languages, which took me to natural language processing, and thinking about how to do hypothesis testing better with machine learning models is what took me to Yellowbrick. Trying to understand more about why models sort of behaved strangely in production is what took me down the path of understanding more about platform engineering and distributed systems, taking like a graduate class in cloud engineering and distributed systems at the University of Maryland, like long after I had finished my PhD, and for no credit, by the way. It was just really just trying to understand like what is consensus and why is that important, and like, do I care about that as a data scientist? Am I even a data scientist anymore? So being willing to like change how you think about yourself is helpful too, and staying sort of curious is nice. I think that helps. I want to sort of speak a little bit to the hype part, because I think that what I would say is it doesn't hurt to assume good intent. So if somebody is spouting hype, like you can decide to think of it as spouting hype, but you could also choose to like think of it as this person is curious. And I kind of am curious about this too. And maybe we can engage along those lines if we sort of assume curiosity and good intent on other people. And the other thing is, if you feel like there's too much hype out there, it's on you to produce thought leadership that is not hype. So put better content out there and tell us like what we're missing.
Yeah.
That's how to do it.
I think that's terrific. Definitely a lot more empathetic than the way that I usually think about it. But one thing that I heard, it was somebody really high up in IBM. During New Reps again this year, he was saying like, okay, like I get hype and like, probably don't want to bet everything on one technology, but also hype is how people know about what we do, right? And people knowing about what we do makes us produce things faster and makes us fail faster, and we figure out where the hype was not necessarily, useful and where maybe it was. And so to him, it's very much a catalyst for just getting more reps in, which is what our industry really does well, is like if you let us get a lot of reps in, we'll figure out what to do right. And so, yeah, there's definitely an exploration there of its own.
Interesting. Like hype as a hypothesis test.
Yeah.
Are people interested in this? Kind of let's put some ideas out there and see if people react. So I like that. Hype as a hypothesis test is sort of an interesting argument.
Yeah. In my consulting in the last couple of years, when I come to companies, they all want a chatbot. And by the time I leave, they got like a new inventory prediction system or something, but like not a chatbot, right?
Right.
But,
or just like a way to search through your documents.
Right. But the thing that got me through the door was the chatbot. And because everybody thinks they want that. And that's great, right? Like then we can have a conversation, and for people who really still need it, let's make a chatbot. But
yeah.
Any final thoughts? Where can people find more about you, about Rotational, how to engage?
So I think LinkedIn is a pretty good place to find me these days. If you are curious about some of the things I'm thinking about, like if you want to read about, the idea of using disposable user interfaces as a medium for data scientists to try to deliver in production a little bit more easily. I post on LinkedIn, I'm trying to do, New Year's resolution. I'm gonna be very, very routine in my posting, but I've posted a couple of times so far this year, and so that's a good way to kind of hear more about what I am thinking about. And if you're curious about rotational, if you're curious about what we do, we are basically an AI studio, right? So, you come to us with kind of a problem, and we'll, like sort of what I've been describing, we sort of talk to you, try to understand a little bit better, and try to figure out a good way to approach that, and the extent to which it would make sense to use machine learning, and maybe some other auxiliary things like databases or retrieval systems or things like that, and try to help solve the whole problem rather than just solving the convenient problem, which is training a model is the convenient one. Getting data, labeling data, engineering that data, getting it into a system, building kind of the pipelines around it. It's the stuff that people are less excited to do, but that we're happy to deliver, because that's really, in my experience, that's what it takes to actually be successful with these kinds of data products. You have to consider the whole solution. So if that's something that you want to think about more or talk about more, please reach out. We're at rotational.io.